Thank you, Ita Buttrose. And we will move on now to our next panel, which is going to be hosted by SBS Chief Political Correspondent and Bureau Chief Anna Henderson. If the panellists wouldn't mind coming up to the stage now, that'd be great. Joining Anna today to talk about a pretty big issue, which is going to be market access. So with Brexit, border closures, US-China tensions and an impending EU trade deal, 2021 certainly was a momentous year when it comes to agricultural trade. So are we doing enough to shore up our market access? Can Australia hold its place in a very volatile global market? All issues to be thrashed out in the next 50 minutes or so. Joining us on the stage, we have Vicki Treadell, the British High Commissioner to Australia. Vicki has held senior roles in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office since she began her Foreign Service career in 1979. Most recently, Mrs Treadell served as the British High Commissioner to Malaysia and New Zealand and Deputy High Commissioner to India. We also have Jane Drake-Brockman. She's an expert on international trade and economic integration. Jane's career has included work with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, the OECD Trade Directorate in Paris, and the International Trade Centre in Geneva. She's also held various positions as a former diplomat, a trade negotiator, and for Indonesia's G20 year, she is the co-chair of T20 Task Force 1. A familiar name to many of you, Professor Andrew Campbell is the CEO of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, or ACR. He was Australia's first national land care facilitator and was CEO of Land and Water Australia for 7 years. Professor Campbell represents Australia at a global level in various roles, and he's still, despite all of that, involved in his family farm. And joining us via video link, we also have Barry O'Farrell, who was announced as Australia's High Commissioner to India in 2020. Mr O'Farrell served in the Parliament of New South Wales for 2 decades, including as Premier, where he initiated trade missions to India. He was also serving as New South Wales's Special Envoy for India, and he's made a significant contribution as the Deputy Chair of the Australia-India Council Board. I'll now hand over to SBS's Chief Political Correspondent and Bureau Chief, Anna Henderson.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks so much. Look, we are in great company today for this discussion, and I think as Lucy's also mentioned, you can contribute. So if you have the Conlog app, you're welcome to send through a question. We'll try and get to those as well. Look, it's been a massive 3 years. We've seen so much change. We've gone through a global pandemic. There have been huge ructions internationally. Australia's been affected by the China trading relationship in particular, but there have been a lot of push and pull factors, and I think we'll get into some of that discussion today. But I wanted to start by asking everyone on the panel, starting with you, Andrew, just what do you think will most profoundly shape Australia's global relationships as we move forward?
Thanks, Anna. I'll leave the trade matters to the trade experts on the panel, but from where I sit, it's what we call the converging insecurities of food security, water security, energy security, all of those amplified by climate change, and no one country can deal with with those issues on their own. So we're going to need multilateral approaches at work. And we're going to need to share knowledge and science, and that's where ACR comes in as a broker and funder of science partnerships across the region as never before to tackle these things. And COVID itself is related to those things as well. So the One Health approach of thinking about environmental health, animal health and human health in an integrated way is going to be crucial, because this pandemic, and I'm still recovering, is the 6th zoonotic pandemic that we've had since 1980. It's not a one in a century thing any more than the floods in Lismore are a 1 in a 100-year events. These things are coming faster, more frequently, and more interconnected with all the other issues, and so we have to think about them in new ways.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about just what kind of an environment we're in right now, because yes, we're going through this now, but who knows when the next big one will hit. Vicki Treadell, what do you think is going to shape this nation going forward, the big factors on the global stage?
Well, I think they're the factors that will shape the world, full stop. So we begin with global health, what we have learnt, touching on many of the points that have just been made, the interdependencies that we have discovered. Who would have thought, in terms of critical supplies, face masks, we were also dependent on one main source. So I think the realization of what we've gone through in the last 2 years is reframing the way we think about how we go forward, who we work with to diversify our supply chains. And I think that diversification and removing the dependencies that we have had for too long in one or two small areas is a key element of this. I would also say the stability of the world in defense and security more broadly, not just the coercion that you referred to at the beginning and what that may yet lead to, but at what we're seeing unfolding in Europe, Russia, Ukraine. That has had impact on things like energy security and food security. The wheat supplies from Ukraine and Russia are going to be hugely disrupted. So finding alternative supply for the grain that feeds the world at the moment is a huge issue. And finally, because it won't go away and it is an important factor, climate change. And I think, sustainability, environmental factors are all going to be things that we have to turn our minds to in a sharper and more focused way going forward.
And an area which, interestingly, hasn't featured as much in the lead up to the election as it perhaps would have if not for COP26, but one which I'm sure will re-emerge at some stage during the campaign, if not as a discussion, certainly as a factor in people's voting intentions. Jane Drake-Brockman, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, Anna, I'm an optimist, and that means I always try and look for the positive, even in a long list of horrible things like that. And so there are two positives I've found in all of that, and one actually is Brexit, because I think that what Brexit has delivered for Australia is not just a new FTA partner. I think it's a new champion for trade, a new pro-trade voice out there on the global stage, and if we're lucky in the regional context as well. Australia has always been into alliance, coalition building, and the fact is we have a new independent ally, and that's going to help us solve that long list of other problems. I think that this will be a kind of enduring positive story for Australia, but there is another positive I want to pinpoint, and believe it or not, it's something that I think has come out of the pandemic. It's actually been mentioned this morning already, and that is something I think we were avoiding even noticing, but the pandemic has really taught us all that we are right in the midst of what's often called the fourth industrial revolution, the transformation to digital. And the government, business and consumer response everywhere, which took us online. I mean, completely took us online for our communication with family, our education, our health, our entertainment, our FTA negotiation, all our business transactions. And I think that has been brought home to every single business and citizen in a way that we were avoiding. And this is going to impact also on our trading relationships, because as we move forward, it will be easier to trade with those economies that have digital standards and digital regulatory regimes that are more like ours. And so our trade policy is also going to shift towards wanting to secure the kind of provisions in trade agreements that are going to enable us from our laptop have a secure, trustworthy online environment with those with whom we buy and sell internationally. And I think that's a big change ahead of us.
Yeah. Well, amid all those big changes, Barry O'Farrell, who's joining us remotely, thank you so much for your time. No, I guess, surprises in what you're about to say, given the news over the weekend. What do you think is most profoundly shaping our global relationships at the moment?
Well, I'll surprise you, Anna, and say that I agree with the British High Commissioner, which is it's the lessons that have come out of COVID and the fact that whether it's health, whether it's economic or whether it's strategic, it's forced countries around the world to reset, to reassess and determine anew. And it means, for instance, in the Indo-Pacific, which is about to account for 2/3 of the world's growth, that will by 2030 have a middle class of 3.5 billion people, that countries here that in the past had either lost faith in free and open trade have been forced to understand that when the world locks down and you're left to your own economic activities, life's tougher. So I think that's why we're seeing countries across the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere starting to re-engage with free trade, and that's what we'll no doubt talk about a bit more.
And of course, the spectre of what's happening in Ukraine is overshadowing all of our conversations at the moment, no doubt, but particularly in this environment. Jane, Drake-Brockman, in terms of those geopolitical tensions in Europe and more broadly, do you believe that the rules-based global system of trade can prevail?
It's a very difficult question, Anna, particularly when you put it in the context of the war in Ukraine. Let me say I hope so, but there are a lot of very big buts. I guess the WTO has always been the linchpin of Australia's trade policy, although the business community probably hasn't seen it that way for quite some time. Credibility in the multilateral system's been very, very low until perhaps the last couple of years when some plurilateral negotiations were launched, for example, on e-commerce. But I think the US-China conflict, which is getting worse, not better, and the new realisations following from the war in Ukraine let's be frank, it's pretty grim in Geneva right now. But I think one thing is for sure, that for the system to not just operate effectively but to survive, I think everybody now realises it has to be reformed, it has to change. And when we get to the point where ministers can't bring home anything for business stakeholders from ministerial meetings, and we have one coming up in about 6 weeks, then I'm sure the Australian government is going to be at the forefront of efforts to hang in there and try and fix it and redesign it. But it's going to start to look different, Anna. And I think the big difference is countries are beginning to realise that if not everyone wants to play by the rules and not everybody's ready to do a deal, well, they'll be left out of the deals. And we will be building a new system which might not look as global as the one we've come to know and cherish, but that is the reality, that is the direction of change.
I mean, how worried should people be out there potentially growing food and fibre or thinking about their trading potential in the situation that we are in globally about whether they can rely upon that rules-based order to function?
Well, okay, well, I would have thought that right now there is a real role for business advocacy, including Australian farm advocacy. We've got wheat prices at nearly all-time highs. We've got serious import dependence in a number of emerging economies, particularly around the Mediterranean, North Africa and the Middle East. We are global food insecurity is skyrocketing to the absolute top of the agricultural agenda. We can't avoid that. Will it be resolved in the WTO? Not clear. But I can tell you one thing. The government can't solve this alone. I mean, the NFF has a fantastic history of advocacy. And we need the Australian farm voice out there right now. If you want to feed people, you keep trade flowing, but export restrictions and stockpiling subsidies are already on the rise for the very reasons you've identified, and it's quite a dangerous time. That is a time for strong Australian pro-trade agricultural voice.
Yeah. And Vicki, in terms of how things are now playing out and the question of whether or not alliances are sort of falling back into really safer relationships with key allies, is that the territory that we're now in, looking for the countries that have those deep cultural values to trade with and to have these relationships with?
I wouldn't quite define it like that. Naturally, at times of stress, you do look at your closest friends and partners, because that's where your most trusted relationships are. But we have to use that as a foundation to build out. Right now, the world is at an inflection point. It's not just about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, it's the axis between Russia and China, because that's an alternative worldview, a different set of global norms. So the challenge to the world as a whole is, what kind of world order do we want? I mean, that's really the big question behind what's playing out, within which the international trading system is one of the battlegrounds, if I can put it that way. So for us, yes, you build the coalition of the like-minded. That gives us the foundation in which to persuade other countries who might be sitting on the fence that there is a moment of trying to make a choice of what kind of world that we want. So completely unrelated, it would appear, but the 141 countries who stood and voted against Ukraine's, the attack on Ukraine at the UN General Assembly recently, the continued voting pattern that we need to keep, all plays into the multilateral agenda and things like the WTO, for example. So if we take that broader geostrategic view, this affects the world order, our trading system, the rules and norms that governs decent global behavior as global citizens. So I do think the alliances that we have for us with Australia, with European countries, with the US, but we also have countries like Japan, and it'd be really interesting to hear what Barry has to say, to get India on side as well. We need the major democracies to stand together. We need to refresh the concept of democracy. And democracy is not the same thing for everybody, but I think those are the challenges of our times because it affects life.
Well, that's a very good way to move on to Barry and to get your thoughts there, Barry, both on how to work out how to get different countries on the same page of that definition and at the same time have productive trading relationships, because we've seen over the weekend Australia and India finalise some of those elements of the trade deal. So how do you have that trading relationship but also instill those values?
I think, firstly, to go to your question about multilateralism, forgive me for the analogy, I think sometimes we need to remember that human nature is often about what's in it for me. And so, often people go into a polling place and say, who is am I going to benefit from this vote? And maybe that's a selfish view by some, but I think, part of the multilateral system that's served us so well for so long, in parts of the world, there are countries that don't believe that they're getting much benefit from. And as a result, some of them are moving towards dealing bilaterally with other nations. And I think there was some of that in terms of the trade agreement that has been delivered between Australia and India. Clearly, India's strategic position, where it shares borders with China, where it has a long-term history with Russia, because post-independence the West seemed to desert India, put it in a tricky position. And as the British High Commissioner has said, the potential alliance between China and Russia is not something that many of us would be in favour of. So, the point is that this is work to have India looking particularly across the Indo-Pacific at its close friends, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, whether it's the United States. And I think that's created some of the conditions which led to the trade deal. Also, the fact that the biggest lesson of COVID, of course, is trusted and secure supply chains with reliable partners. Australia has a complementary economy, and across the field, we're able to provide inputs to the Indian economy that will enable them to achieve the economic growth required when every month in India, 1 million people turn 18 and have to either have jobs or places in skill centres or places in universities. That's the challenge that India has, is feeding its hugely growing young demographic, providing them with the opportunities that in Britain, Australia and elsewhere we take for granted. And I'm grateful for Professor Campbell and everything that ACIR does, because the Happy Cedar is one of the happy stories of the Australian-India relationship. It's a great demonstration of Australian agricultural ingenuity, and it progressively is being spread out across the country.
And just to follow on from something Andrew said earlier, Barry, just to get a sense for us here in Canberra as to the long tail of the pandemic in India and how that's sort of featuring into the discussions about free trade deals, pharmaceutical deals, those kind of aspects of what happens internationally. Can you give us a sense of what's going on there at the moment?
Done a remarkable job with COVID, and at the present time, like parts of the rest of the world, we're at a low point, which means travel's possible. I don't think we'll see any further return to lockdowns in this country any more than I think that's going to happen elsewhere. We have to learn to live with COVID, but in a country of 2.4 billion people, you can understand that the challenges of dealing with COVID were tremendous. But this is a country that has vaccinated, as of now, almost all of its population twice. Available. It's the pharmacy of the world. It's manufacturing vaccines that are available, and indeed their largest vaccine manufacturer, Serum Institute, has stopped producing at the moment because, of course, worldwide people have stopped taking up the vaccine. So the COVID accentuated for India the over-reliance for imports on certain countries, the need to develop their own industries more, and the need to look to partners across all sectors from which to start to trade.
Thank you. Vicki, Treadell, in terms of the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement, we often hear it described by our Prime Minister here in Australia as a gold standard deal. But what is it that makes it that, in your view?
Several things, apart from the fact that your Prime Minister said it, so has mine. So we have consensus there. Look, it is the most liberalising agreement signed by Australia outside that Australia has with New Zealand. It has a number of new elements that Australia has never had in an FTA. So, for example, Jane was referring to the digital agenda. The innovation chapter that we have is genuinely new and groundbreaking. It includes provisions for how we use innovation to drive trade, of which digital trade is a key aspect. Paperless processing of exports. As an example, how we improve online activity on that front. The mobility provisions that the FTA provides for as well, in terms of mutual recognition of qualifications, the greater movement of our young people between our two countries, so raising the age of our working holidaymaker programs to 35 from 30. And of course, when we come to tariffs, certainly for this community in the room, the removal of tariffs on red meat over a 10-year period with a 5-year grace period after that to make any adjustments if they're needed. I mean, that's significant for the British meat industry, getting that passed and getting that through. So if we look at the provisions also, something like 99% of all tariffs from the agricultural sector have absolutely fallen away as a result of this. So from your seafood to your grains to fruit and vegetables, the opening up of a 70 million customer market in the UK, I think is pretty groundbreaking as well. And certainly there are new provisions for sugar as well, again phased in over a period, but again all tariffs falling away, which should be good news for sugarcane farmers, particularly in Queensland. All your tropical fruit farmers, particularly in the Northern Territory. You know, our supermarkets, when we talk about global supply chains and sourcing product, this genuinely opens up the British market in a way that it never has done for Australian produce. So all of that is really good news. And there are also provisions in our FTA on the economic empowerment of women. We want it to be a whole of economy opportunity. There are references to Indigenous business group opportunities as well. And environmental provisions, which are increasingly important around the whole sustainability of supply. And for the British consumer, who often lead global trends in terms of consumer choice. British supermarkets were the first one to introduce things like fair trade, the provenance of food. People really care about what they buy. So I think, you know, for a lot of Australian producers and at the value addition end of the industry as well, a consumer demand for different product, for the provenance of goods. That's why it's a gold standard.
And look, there have been, I know, a number of criticisms of the deal. And in fact, I was over with the two prime ministers at one point of their international trip where they were talking about it. But when it comes down to it, how important is it on a diplomatic front that kind of agreement is made to then make a through line for the other things that both countries want to achieve?
Well, it comes back to a point that Jane said. You know, we, having stepped away from the EU, are looking at the world in a different way. Of course, the European Union, with its single market, 450, 500 million people on our doorstep, may have led to a level of complacency. Our engagement internationally may have also been pulled back as a result. But having stepped away from the EU to regain a global role for ourselves, achieving our first bold free trade agreement was really important. So that's another reason why it's a gold standard. It was a historic first for us. After 45 years of having ceded our trade policy competence to Brussels, regaining it was also a statement of our intent globally to be an activist advocate of free trade, to deal with the very issues we've touched on earlier. Securing the FTA with Australia, quickly followed by the one that we've also secured with New Zealand. We've rolled over something like 87 arrangements that we had through the EU with a number of other countries, including Japan and Singapore as examples in this region. But it has also led to our application to cede to the CPTPP. And we are close to concluding that, we hope by the end of this calendar year, becoming part of the CPTPP as advocates of free trade. We will be, we hope, an important partner alongside Australia and other CPTPP members to help shape the rules. And by being part of these new trade arrangements, how we play that back into our role at the WTO to be a force for good and to influence the kind of global norms and rules that enable people to trade freely. And that's also linked to things like the work we're doing on maritime security, because the trading routes, most agricultural produce, bulk produce, has to go by sea freight.
Can I pick up there on the CPTPP and just get your thoughts? It's actually a question from the floor from Carl Ellis. Thank you. In terms of the interest being shown by China and Taiwan amongst other countries, do you think that the United States will end up signing on?
I don't know the answer to that. You'll have to ask, when we have a new US ambassador here, or the chargé. We would hope so. They were there at inception, chose not to pursue it under the Trump administration. Now, whether or not they will return to the table, I think it is our hope that, a significant global player like the US being part of that will be a good thing. So our joining means that we're part of a bloc that we hope has the power of attraction for others to come, but being part of that group also setting the new benchmarks and standards by the way we joined and the evidence we had to give of our intent sets a benchmark for how others can join in the future.
Wait and see. All right, we'll try and get the new US ambassador in for a question when she arrives. Andrew, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research has a very significant role, and you are somewhat constrained at this point, given we are so close to an election, in what you can probably say. But where do you see the intersection of aid and trade at this point?
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I think the people in this room know very well that our agricultural innovation system in Australia is an incredible asset, and agricultural science has always been an international enterprise. So we produce about 2% of the world's papers, scientific papers in ag science. We draw in knowledge from all over the world, but the knowledge that we've developed here in farming an old continent, not blessed with the best soils and with a very variable climate, is incredibly relevant. As Barry said, our direct seeding, trash retention, conservation cropping technologies, incredibly relevant in India, where they've got a major problem with air quality from stubble burning and loss of nutrient and so on. Our biosecurity work is incredibly valuable for countries in our region to help them meet phytosanitary standards and so on. Take Japanese encephalitis, the leading Australian scientist on that got his knowledge on ACR projects working overseas. So same with Fusarium wilt in bananas. There's a whole bunch of stories over the last 40 years where the science partnerships that we have with the countries in our region, one, get both countries working together on shared problems below the political noise in the background, and that creates ballast in the relationships that then helps trade to work more freely. And helping countries solve those technical issues is really valuable soft diplomacy, and it's something that Australia is really good at. And ACR was set up for that purpose 40 years ago, and I think it's more relevant today than ever.
Are we learning from other countries around us, countries that may not be considered as wealthy as Australia, but in how we are conducting this research?
Absolutely. Talking to one of our research partners recently, they were saying that with a certain Pacific country dealing in fisheries, 30 years ago there was one person in the ministry that had a degree, and now there's well over 100 with more than a dozen PhDs. And so you can have a completely different relation, and we've got 800 odd of those alumni across the region that have been trained in Australia, have deep links with Australian institutions. That gives us a really solid platform for jointly tackling problems. And there's some fantastic, the best eucalypt and acacia breeding facility around now is in Hanoi. And if you go to Bunnings or IKEA and buy the outdoor furniture, it'll be acacia, bred from clonal propagation out of Hanoi, And that's a $4 billion a year industry set up off the back of ACR projects, but with deep scientific collaboration underpinning it. And that's something that I think is one of the best things that Australia does across the region, and it's deeply valued by those partner countries.
Jane, you've worked in Brussels and you've looked closely at our trade with the EU. What are the chances of achieving a high-quality agreement between Australia and the EU that would sort of please the audience in this particular room?
Well, this FTA with the EU is not exactly our most popular one, and that's, it's not only the business stakeholders in this room, it's much more widespread hesitation on the part of the Australian business community, frankly. Perhaps it's just worth, asking for a minute why before I come to what I think
you beat me to it, yes.
Going to happen next. Well, the EU does tend to believe in the non-negotiable extraterritorial imposition on its FTA partners of EU standards, whether they're phytosanitary standards or digital standards or climate standards or human rights standards or, I'm summarising them all as standards, but we tend to prefer open, non-discriminatory, international standards, benchmarks, principles, and preferably ones that are developed with a lot of stakeholder input. So there was a second factor, and that is that right from the outset there was a sense that the EU itself was a bit reluctant on this FTA, and that Australia was the demandeur, and in those circumstances, I think the business community generally felt, well, Australia might give too much away too soon and without full business support. And because I think there is a deep suspicion in the Australian business community that the EU 27 is not as pro-trade as we think they ought to be. And but what I think now is that the pendulum, Anna, is finally actually swinging in Australia's favour. Now, and I'm an optimist, okay, but I think that recent events from the US-China conflict to the war in Ukraine have really brought it home to Europeans that they also need to diversify away from dependence on traditional markets. And I think there's going to be a greater appetite to do business with Australia, and that augurs well for a good FTA deal. Now, it's not going to be easy, and it might not be by the end of this year. It might take into next year, but I think that our government, whichever it is going to be very practical and very pragmatic and very evidence-based about this. They're not going to agree until it is a good deal that they can take back to the Australian business community. But I don't think the audience in this room should give up on this FTA. Look, in my own field, which is digital trade, the two parties are universes apart. But the two business communities actually see it exactly the same way. And I think there's a role for the business community themselves to help find landing zones. And again, I would say, the NFF knows how to do this. And look, I've seen it before in my posting in Brussels. I was there when we negotiated the wine deal. We didn't want to give up white Burgundy or Chablis, but it was the Australian wine growers themselves and the Wine and Brandy Corporation leading them through that negotiation that found the landing zone in their own commercial interests. It was not an easy negotiation, but we got there. We've done it before. I think we can do it again.
All right, well, the challenge has been set. And that swings me on to you, Barry, because I'd be interested to hear, we've obviously had a lot of focus on agricultural markets over the course of this free trade agreement process, which has been ventilated again over the last couple of days. But what are the opportunities that stem from it and still can be taken up for Australian agriculture in India? You're on mute.
Can I just make 4 points? Firstly, that India to some extent will always be a top-up market because, if there's a dry monsoon season, India goes out to the market to buy in quantity, and will also always buy, as I suppose most people do, the quantity at the best possible price they can get. Secondly, though, the trade deal does allow access through for a variety of agricultural products that I think will make a difference to Australian farming and provide certainty for Australian farming. And if I can use an analogy I should never touch, which is wine. Part of the deal on wine that has been made is that it will have most favoured nation treatment, which means that any better deal India does with any other country on wine will automatically flow through to Australia. Now, if I can get away from wine for a moment, the other 2 points
go back
I
to
want
wine,
to make.
Barry.
It'd be nice. The other 2 points I want to make is that, I get the fact that I don't think there's ever been a trade deal done in any country that has universally satisfied everybody. There's no finish line in trade deals or trade agreements any more than there's finish lines in bilateral relations. And, don't be surprised, given my background, that I also understand that as good as government is in doing these deals, and Dan Tehan and his colleagues have done a great deal with India that will continue to grow over the coming decades, but government cannot do it alone. Government is simply opening doors, and we need industry to capitalise on those opportunities. And so I sit here in New Delhi. I like an apple. We were granted market access for apples 20 years ago, but I can't buy an Australian apple. I can buy a New Zealand apple. I can buy a US apple. So we need to ensure that the efforts of governments, of trade negotiators in putting together trade agreements are picked up by our innovative and extraordinary agriculture and other sectors, because there are opportunities in this country of 2.4 billion people. You only need a small share of India to have a big slice of a market anywhere else in the world.
Now, thank you, Barry, another question from the floor. I'll just bring the two elements together from John Ridley and Susan Graham. We've, of course, had in the news today the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report released, talking about the changing climate and the potential impacts on agriculture and food security. Can I hear from all of you, starting with you, Andrew, as to what kind of a alarm bell this rings and what needs to come from another report, again making this point about essentially time running out?
I think that the latest IPCC report shows that global emissions are still going up, and the remarks of the Secretary-General and others that clearly the decarbonisation agenda has to take a step change into something far more intensive and extensive than what we've seen to date. And so that creates enormous opportunities. And that, I think we've heard some of that this morning, and Tony's slide about the increase in ESG investment and that investment pool. Australia is very well placed to be an innovation leader, not just at the technical side of reducing emissions and carbon accounting and innovative sequestration measures and so on, but in the design of the frameworks to enable that to happen. So the governance, the accounting, the measurement, the pricing systems and so on. We're finding there's enormous interest in partner countries around the world in the agricultural parts of the Emission Reduction Fund, the old Carbon Farming Initiative and so on, that again Australia has a lot of very relevant expertise to share. But what this latest IPCC report shows is that the urgency, incrementalism isn't going to get us where we need to go. We have to be prepared to take it to a completely different, not just a new level, but a completely different level. And that's going to be a huge priority that'll shape, as the scientists call it, the living space for humanity this century.
Vicki, Treadell, how important is it that every country plays a part here, that it's not just based on sort of the overall emissions from each country, but how important is it that there's sort of examples set in this space?
hugely important. I mean, the position of the British government over the last year and over the coming year up until Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November, when we hand over the COP presidency to Egypt. So we remain COP president. And keeping countries to the commitments they made in signing up to the Glasgow Climate Pact remains a top foreign policy priority for the British government and our global network. So fantastic that countries have made commitments to net zero by 2050. Fantastic that many, many countries have also come up with more ambitious NDCs for 2030. These are not about targets for target's sake. It's about giving clarity to business, industry, and investment. I know this last week my Prime Minister hosted an investment roundtable with some of the major Australian investors in Britain, from Macquarie Bank through to AusSuper, who committed in pounds, I haven't done the conversion, £28 billion in the coming years, investing in our energy transition, in our bet on offshore wind, in our bet on hydrogen, in our bet on the sort of new battery technology that we're going to need, and the whole supply chain investment that we're going to need for the new technologies and industries that will deliver a cleaner, greener future, within which agricultural technology is an essential part, how we deal with all of that. So it is important that we don't just talk about the targets, they're secondary. It's what are we going to do to really transform our economies. We all recognize that in the transition, in any energy mix, it's about how you phase in the new technologies whilst you phase out the old ones, which will still have a lifespan in that transition. But we know that we have, where are we now, a 28-year timeline to get to net zero by 2050. That's 3 generations of transition. Are we looking at the curriculum of our education system to deliver the skills and expertise in our young people who will be graduating into the jobs of the future? So it's a highly complex thing, but it requires policies, it requires a regulatory framework, it requires clarity for our business and industry so that we all understand the journey that we're embarking on, what it looks like, what each milestone indicates. And actually, this is about economic opportunity. We've seen the effects of climate, not least in the farming community. Droughts are more severe and longer. Flooding, rain, cyclonic conditions are getting worse. Climate has always changed over the millennia. It's just that the horizons are now foreshortening, and we're seeing yet greater extremes in every year. How many times are these events now happening? Our ability to adapt, to mitigate, and adjust as much as we transform our economies and our energy requirements are pressing demands that no government in any part of the world can ignore.
And Jane, do you think that those signals and that environment has now been created? We saw COP26 unfold. We've seen various policy announcements made. Do you think business has the signals to drive in that direction at this point?
Well, in a nutshell, I do, but I think Andrew and Vicki have really answered this question, and there's not a lot I can add. I'm very worried about things like carbon border tax adjustments and the impact of all of the environmental policy announcements on some trade issues that are going to be very real for Australia. But I would like just to say one very quick thing about the link you made between climate change and food security, because my eyes are very much on the next 12 months, I'm afraid. It's very real. The food insecurity is very real. Food prices are going up. Energy prices are going up. You know, it's a global market for cereal. The price is cleared globally. Food prices will go up here also. And we really have, I mean, the Northern Hemisphere growing season now, the US hasn't planted that much more. Labour shortages, just like we have. The EU hasn't planted that much more. Fertiliser prices are preventing it. We have a real problem, and it's going to be before the next Australian wheat crop is coming on board. So we heard from the Prime Minister today that the economic impact of the lockdown was 30 times greater than the global financial crisis. We aren't out of this yet. We are not out of the economic impact of the war in Ukraine. It's going to be very real, and it's going to, the agricultural sector is a fundamental part of it.
Barry, is this food security conversation happening in a very real sense in India at the moment? And how much airtime has the IPCC report actually got over in New Delhi?
Look, one of the things that's impressed me in the time that I've been here has been the way in which state and centre governments here have been pushing towards renewable, to reduction of carbon, and the way in which that's backed by large Indian business houses. So, you know, whether it's some of the major business houses of India, most of them are now significant investors in renewable energy across India. India's announced that it's expanding its nuclear power production, all designed to try and reduce the reliance on those carbon industries.
And has the climate change reporting today that we've seen in Australia made its way to India? Is it a big story there?
Well, unfortunately, it's only just gone 10 o'clock here. I've come straight from a breakfast to your session, so I haven't seen it. I haven't even been able to access it on Twitter yet. So
I'll have to check the papers. Look, we're getting towards the end of the session, and thanks so much for the people who have sent in questions. I will just check if there are any more that I can raise. But as we move towards wrapping up, can I hear briefly from each of you? I think you've touched on some of the concerns, and Jane, despite being an optimist, you've also really raised some, I think, food for thought for a lot of people in this room. But if you could just give a sense to everyone here of what's the best thing Australia could be doing to advance its interests on the world stage right now. Andrew.
Oh, look, Anna, I need to be... I'd be shot if I didn't say the best thing we can do is invest in international agricultural research partnerships. So.
And we appreciate that. Vicki?
Of course, Australia is one of our greatest friends and allies. It plays a tremendous role on the world stage. So working in partnership with Australia on the big issues that matter, the geostrategic issues that we've touched on, their advocacy and partnership at the UN, WTO, it's never been more important for countries like Australia to maintain their global voice.
And Jane, I'm just going to jump in here because there is a question I wanted to put to you for this final thought from the floor. It's from Fiona Simpson, in fact. She asks, as a largely non-subsidised industry, we despair at the parlous state of the World Trade Organisation. Australia already chairs the Cairns Group, yet protectionism is rife. Other than NFF advocacy, where to now?
Oh, well, Fiona, it goes to actually what I was going to say in response to Anna's own question, because, but you've taken the question offshore. Coming back onshore for a minute, I think that what the Australian government has to do and doesn't do, it does not work closely enough with the business associations, with business stakeholders. It just doesn't. I mean, if you look at the DFAT website on commercial diplomacy, there's no pillar there about working with business stakeholders. And the simple fact is governments don't trade, businesses do. It's businesses that buy from other businesses in global value chains. It just is ridiculous for government to think that there isn't a role for track 2 commercial diplomacy. Now, the Cairns group has always had its farm leaders group, and they met before the ministerial meeting in Argentina. But are they going to meet again in Geneva? Yes, that's good news. That's very good news if they're meeting again before the upcoming ministerial, because that already is a sign of the right things happening. It's when you don't meet, when you decide there's no incentive to meet anymore, that I'll start getting really worried. So I think it is important that the farm leaders meet. The agenda is as important as it ever was. And if that farm leaders group doesn't meet, you know, all the work of the Cairns group actually risks unravelling in the next little while. So I just would say where to next is, you know, government has to understand that track 2 action by the business community out there, getting the pro-trade voice out there, is fundamental. You have all my support. I would argue that the Australian government should be funding the farm leaders group like it used to do, frankly.
Thank you. And Barry, finally to you on that question of what Australia could be doing better to sell itself on the world stage, but maybe in a bit more of a tailored sense, what can the Australian farming community and the groups that represent Australian farmers be doing on the world stage to get into those markets and to sell their products?
Well, I think, Anna, they should be doing what they've been doing so well for so long, which is Australian produce is respected. It's known for its quality. For me, what the NFF and New South Wales farmers and others ought to do is organise some delegations to come out here to see the opportunities. And can I just say to Jane that we've just launched an update of the India Economic Strategy to 2035, where we, across both countries, sat down with 600 different groups, including producers and businesses and diaspora, to update that great work that Peter Varghese did in 2018, which provides, you know, an opportunity to alert certain sectors, including agriculture, to the opportunities on offer in India. But there's nothing like coming and seeing yourself. I know, and if you can't come yourself, go and talk to one of your Indian friends in Australia, because they'll tell you about it.
All right, and I want to ask you all who you think is going to win the election, but I know everybody will have a fairly careful answer. So I suppose one thing just to actually finalise this discussion might be we go into a period now of caretaker mode in Australia and an election campaign, but in a very risky international climate, with a lot of things kind of bearing up on Australia and on the farming community here. Would any of the panellists like to perhaps comment on the best way that the people in this room can kind of work through the next 6 to 8 weeks and capitalise and make sure that they're still on track with those trading relationships and with what they're trying to achieve?
I mean, look, I think what we're seeing now with all the economic sanctions, we're seeing Russia moving back into autarky. And I think we're all seeing how problematic that is for the Russian people. I mean, at a time like this, what we don't want to do is hunker down and become protectionist and close our borders. We have to stay focused on engaging with the rest of the world. I mean, I would say that what we're seeing right now is a kind of trade policy arms race going on. And what that means is we keep that flag flying for trade, not for not trading, for trading. And I just think that's the most important message when our government's offline, figuring out who's going to be the next government. Our job is to keep that flag flying.
Well, thank you so much. The floor is open if anyone else wanted to contribute. Unsurprisingly not. All right. Well, look, we just want to thank everyone who's contributed so much for taking part. The British High Commissioner, Vicki, Treadell, Jane Drake-Brockman from the University of Adelaide, Andrew Campbell from the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, and from New Delhi, Barry O'Farrell, Australia's High Commissioner to India. Thank you all, and thank you.